Hey, true crime fans! Tired of ads interrupting your gripping investigations? Good news! With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. After all, ads shouldn't be the scariest thing about true crime. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free true crime. That's amazon.com/ad-free true crime to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Hey there. Looking to level up your shopping experience? Let me introduce you to Amazon Live. If you haven't heard, it's a shoppable video experience where influencers and creators showcase the latest must-haves all while you shop in real time. And for those who love some celeb gossip, reality stars like Kyle Richards, Lala Kent, and friend of the pod, Paige DeSorbo. On her new show, In Bed with Paige DeSorbo, Paige invites top-tier guests to cozy up in her fluffy bed where they spill secrets, share nighttime routines, and even whip up midnight snacks. Stream and shop new episodes of her series In Bed with Paige DeSorbo every Tuesday at 7 p.m. ET by going to amazon.com/live/Paige_DeSorbo. Or you can watch Amazon Live's new live TV channel on Freevee or Prime Video under the DIY section and shop along on your phone.
Hello and welcome to 31 Days of Terror, day number 21. And for today's episode, I am joined by the wonderful Tim Cloke. Tim is a regular on Patreon and has been the co-host on 3 main episodes too. He is an avid historian and all-round good guy. Today he is bringing us a deep dive into stone monuments from around the British Isles. You can follow Tim on YouTube at Mr Cloke History and on Instagram at Dry Wipe History. The links to his YouTube and Instagram will be in the description of this episode, and this episode was recorded remotely, so the sound quality may be different to what you are used to. And I'm joined today in the virtual studio by the wonderful, the glowing, the fiery, the fantastic Tim Cloke. I really ran out of adjectives there. I couldn't think of a single one.
You really did. I think glowing is probably a reference to my nose right now because I've got a bit of a cold. And is it really glowing bright red like Rudolph?
I mean, I didn't want to say.
So if I sound a little bit different, that'll be why. But don't worry, I'm not fishing for sympathy. I'm fine. I went to work the last couple of days, so it's not that bad.
We were just discussing the merits of having a cold when you're teaching. You know what I mean? And being like, guys, come on. I'm not feeling well, right? You got to work with me here. Yeah. And honestly, teenagers are generally very good. They'll be like, okay, we see you're not feeling great, but you're here. We're going to pipe down and get on with what we need to do.
Just a slightly exasperated, very tired look across the room and they go, oh, sorry. And you go, it's all right. Let's get on.
Forgot you're sick. Sorry. And you're like, yeah, come on, get that written down. It's great.
Well, we've had open mornings as well. So I've had lots of familiar faces coming and thinking, oh, I went to school with you and you and you. And they're sort of shocked to see me as well. So it's been a lot of fun, actually. But yes, it's the weekend now, which means we've got a bit of time to do some recording. And I've been very much looking forward to this one.
Oh, I like no shade to your other 3 stories, right? 2 of which I've heard, and we haven't done the Battlefields one yet, but this is the one I'm most excited about.
And yeah, I've already told you this is the one which is probably the least spooky. I mean, it's definitely spooky adjacent. But this is some proper history and archaeology we're going to be discussing today.
Yeah, and death stuff. I love death stuff. I could talk about death all day.
Well, it's we are going to be looking at what I've called the secrets of ancient stones today. And so we're going to be looking at prehistoric rituals. We're going to be looking at prehistoric death rites and death rituals as far as we can work it out from the record, but also looking at that really difficult to interpret but utterly fascinating area of just how did they interpret the world, how did they interpret the sky and celestial objects. And we're going to try and do a bit of a deep dive into 4 different areas today. And it's 4 different sites that I've chosen. And we're going to be doing some comparisons and some investigations. And if you've got any questions, you know what to do. Just stop me and ask.
Oh, I'm very excited about this. I feel like I'm going to learn loads in this episode and no pressure.
Oh, of course. No, I don't feel any at all. Actually, I feel a little bit because, of course, like I've said to you, there's always that slight nervousness of thinking, well, this isn't going to be conventional ghost stories. This is going to be things that have been mentioned obliquely in various episodes that you've done and that I've done. But I think people are really going to like it because it's something I'm really passionate about as well. But before we get on to that, can I actually ask you a question about one of the mini episodes that you've done recently?
Yes.
So I think it's mini episode 392 with Rebecca's story with the steam train and the Lancaster bomber.
Yes.
Now, this is very much my wheelhouse, isn't it? But what I
Yes.
really loved about this, and I don't know whether Rebecca is really familiar with this, and perhaps she is, but when she described the sound of the steam train letting off steam before it left, that is something that they very legitimately do. And remember, we did these stories or ghost stories related to the railways on Patreon about 2 years ago, I think, didn't we? And it really reminded me of that because, I mean, without going into the technicalities of it, which would just bore everyone to tears, sometimes they do let off a load of steam from the front of the engine to basically blast all the water out the cylinders and stop them getting jammed up with water and jammed full open. And so the way that she described that as it leaving and then chuffing off along the line and into the tunnel was so authentic. It just rang completely true to me, and I thought that really added to it. So if Rebecca wasn't aware of that, then I think that adds a lot of legitimacy and credibility, I should say, to her story. And as for the Lancaster bomber, well, I think the circumstances as described were it was flying above them and silent, and then it exploded.
Yes, silently flying above them, silently exploded, and then down into the water or whatever it was underneath them.
This is it. I mean, I don't know whether what I'm about to say actually lends this more credibility or sounds like a bit of a debunking, and I think actually it can be both, is the idea of seeing that on return for a mission is entirely realistic because it was very much worked out that you could rather calculate when the British bombers were going to be returning to their bases, and they were indeed in the north of England. I think Rebecca mentioned that she was in Yorkshire. The German Air Force would send night fighters, radar-equipped night fighters, to the coastal regions, but even they would sneak into the landing pattern of the other bombers. And so the poor gunners aboard these planes could not switch off for a single second, not even once they had crossed friendly coast and they were on the landing
not
pattern.
even once they were like, home is in sight.
So once the navigator has said friendly coast ahead, it didn't mean that they could switch off because they could be in the very landing pattern and see a plane form up behind them. And then before they know it, there's the blink of guns firing and that's it. And so that could well explain what they saw, regardless of whether it was an apparition of that happening, because it would be something that would happen in those areas, or whether they saw an actual attack on another aircraft at night, because it would be such a common thing to see. Either way, I think that's a fascinating and quite credible detail to the story. So I really love that. I was pretty much shouting these facts at my phone when I was listening to it while I was preparing my tea the other day. But hopefully, if Rebecca's listening, then she'll appreciate those extra details.
She did say, I think, at the end of her story, like, if anybody else has experienced stuff like this, can you let me know? And I thought it was so genius to put it up as a local news story to be like, I wonder if anybody else has experienced this. I mean, I can't even imagine her joy and validation when other people were like, oh my God, I've heard this too. It must have felt bloody great.
Yeah, I mean, that's even better than when you hear the same thing in the pub as someone else that you think is a little bit weird, or you see someone else has seen the same thing. But to hear that validation from a complete stranger as a result of a newspaper article or advert or however she did it, absolutely brilliant move. And I think everyone should try that now.
Oh, yeah. And there'll just be articles everywhere now. We're going to prompt a deluge of spooky articles.
Let's do it. I think this is what local newspapers need to increase their circulation.
Yeah.
That's cool, though. I wanted to get that in before we get going. But basically, I'm ready to start our, I hopefully quite spooky look into some British Isles archaeology and to try and achieve the impossible of understanding prehistoric ancestors just that little bit better. A weak light pierced the narrow rectangular entrance to dimly illuminate the great stones making up the walls. Upon them, picked out to highlight the shadow and containing dyes of ochre, woad and umber, were a series of engraved chevrons and spirals, the latter perhaps representing the interplay of life and death and the eternal nature of the spirit world. A woman carried a distinctively decorated clay urn with cord decoration and diagonal marks around a broad collar below the rim. She approached the centre of the passageway and then turned to the right, where in a shadow a chamber lay. Kneeling, she carefully upended the contents of the urn, and the ash-covered bones fell out. A light breeze caught through the passageway from the sea air outside whirled a few fragments of ash into the air, revealing partially burnt limb bones, and there, blackened but complete, the jaw with still gleaming white teeth. A tear ran down the woman's cheek as she spoke a few words of prayer for the man now laid with his ancestors. She watched from the chamber as men entered with other pots and urns. The still smouldering remains of the funeral pyre were poured from one urn into a pre-dug pit in the middle of the crossway. There had been feasting before the departed had been laid to the rest. But some of the food had been saved. A stew of locally caught wildlife, small fish called wrasse, eels, frogs, hare, mice and shrews, was tipped on top of the ashes, which gave off a weak sizzle as first until the remaining embers were quenched. The ritual complete, the pit was closed, covered, and then marked with a layer of white limpet shells and quartzite pebbles. The people knew that the dead were not really gone. When they were needed, they would return to the barrow and ask them to intercede when the crops withered or the cattle starved and died. Until then, their open tomb would remain looking out from its cliff-top vantage point onto the brackish lakes, sandy shore, and rocky cliffs of the bay, which had for centuries sustained the living in a landscape separate from the dead. The scene I have described here is largely imagined, but it contains within it details which are certain. I could have described any number of roughly contemporary sites, but for this recreation I chose one that I have at least been to. Known today as Barclodiad Agawdes, or the Giantess's Apron in Welsh, this mound on the western clifftops of Anglesey, Wales, was constructed in the Neolithic period, some 5,000 years ago. When I went there, it was early morning, and my group had special permission to unlock the modern gates and enter the monument. I have seen carved stones, still retaining faint signs of their paint, picked out on the vertical surfaces of the chamber, though the human remains described have long since decayed or been excavated. The central pit still contains some pebbles and shells, and an earlier excavation confirmed that it did indeed contain the redeposited remains of at least one cremation pyre and a curious stew of small local animals. In this episode, the ghosts that we will discuss must be those that you imagine for yourselves. Though the physical remains I will describe do exist, they must be interpreted. Bare stones and mounded earth do not contain the direct link to the past that we might wish that they did. However, the first acceptance that you must take is that very little of what we will discuss here can be known for certain. In an age of instant access to information, that can at first be a frustration. I invite you to embrace the uncertainty, even revel in it. Your interpretations may well as be correct as any other, for we can never know the truth, only peer through time at partial clues, glimpse through the lens of interpretation at fleeting images of those long departed. Today, we discuss the practices of the living and their relationship with the dead in the British Neolithic and Bronze Ages. And through that, we try to interpret their beliefs about their ancestors and the spirit world. Perhaps the origins of modern ghost lore begin with these deep buried and yet unforgotten origins. Do you have any initial questions about prehistory?
No, not initially, but I did appreciate the fact that you said, like, this is all interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing these things. We are seeing, burial mounds, whatever is in them. There's certain things that you can say, I imagine, in archaeology with certainty, right? But a lot of it has to be interpreted and figured out, and some of it is guesswork, and you're saying, at this time period, people were known to be doing these things, so maybe this means that.
It's sometimes slightly easier to rule things out than to rule things in.
Yeah.
So you might be able to find a piece of evidence that says, well, that remain in the ground must have come before the other one because of how it's been laid down or because of some scientific dating method. But in terms of linking that to the living, breathing people who laid these things there, well, we just don't have that connection. We can see what they did, but in terms of their motivations, that cannot be preserved in an abstract way when all you've got is the physical remains. So that's the big challenge here. And really, I think it's important to realize that the word prehistory means before the time of the recorded past. So there is no written culture that survives from these time periods. And so all we have are those scant remains that they have left behind. And I thought it might be useful for listeners to hear a sort of not so much of a glossary, but maybe an explanation of some of the key themes and terminology that we're going to be using throughout the rest of this episode. So I'm going to continue with that, if I may. A running theme today will be the similarity between so many of these monuments. Until reasonably recent times, it was assumed, perhaps patronisingly, that people in what we now call the British Isles were unsophisticated and poorly connected to others around these islands. Yet physical similarities between their monuments and physical evidence of deep and organised cultural and logistical connections between not only ancient British peoples, but those on continental Europe, will appear time and time again. It is worth, though, considering some of the terminology which we will use. Firstly, because for simplicity, when we are dealing with some of the older sources, I will refer to dates BC rather than BCE for before Common Era. Neolithic means the new Stone Age and relates to the earliest farmers and the adoption of agriculture in what we now call the British Isles about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, roughly 4,100 BC to 2,500 BC. The Neolithic succeeded the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age, which had been a time of hunting and gathering with seasonal, nomadic living that left little record of permanent habitation between the end of the last ice age and the arrival of the new farmers, or the adoption of agriculture by Mesolithic people. The Bronze Age represented the era where the first metal tools are found in the agricultural record. Following a brief period of copper use, the addition of tin and antimony to make the harder, shinier alloy of bronze ushered in a new age. The change in material culture lasted roughly between 2500 BC and 800 BC before the adoption of more easily sharpened and moulded iron. In the early Neolithic, the British Isles were still incredibly heavily forested, with some areas recently cleared by the force of burning or with the sharp flint axes felling trees. At first, as Mesolithic peoples transitioned from a purely nomadic and hunter-gatherer existence to one of agriculture, it seems that they started by domesticating cattle, goats and sheep for milk and meat, before adopting cereal grains sometime later. While at first the quality of the diet decreased somewhat, the stability and availability of food increased, allowing populations to swell. Agriculture also had another profound impact. As peoples increasingly adapted to the landscape and used it to their own ends, suddenly areas of land became owned. There was a need to define land and physically express an area that this is ours. It is into this context that monuments of both the living and the dead were built, and built to be conspicuous. Today, a Norman or even Saxon church is considered precious and a rare survivor, rightly so. They're often considered places of worship that have lasted in that role for maybe 1,000 years or perhaps slightly more. And yet, we have prehistoric monuments that appear to have remained of the same significance for literally thousands of years. Indeed, in some rare cases, they were adapted as Christian places of worship, remaining sacred for perhaps 6,000 years, give or take a century or three, right up until this day.
That glossary is very helpful because you could say Neolithic to me and I'm like, I don't know when that is.
Yeah.
That could be any time period. I don't know.
It's still a word that you hear kind of thrown around quite a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, and you sort of vaguely think, I know what that means, kind of vaguely. But then hearing the actual time period, I'm like, I'm not sure that's what I thought it was.
It's quite specific to be related to the adoption of architecture in a particular area.
Yeah.
So although much of the material culture that's left behind remains things that are made of stone, because of course the stone survives, it is quite specific about the adoption of architecture, domestication of animals, and the production of cereal grains, for example. And I'm actually going to do something which is maybe a bit of a risk in an audio medium like a podcast, but I'm going to show you one of the most revolutionary things that has ever been invented.
Oh my God, go on, I'm excited.
And it's this. I mentioned that the British Isles used to be covered in trees and that they were cleared in a large number of areas, either through burning or through the adoption of stone axes. And this is a real stone axe that I found in Yorkshire about 10 years ago.
Cool.
Well, it's not even the beginning of just how cool this is. So in case anyone's worried, this has been recorded as far as possible by the local antiquities scheme. So it's all very much above board. I've not just looted it from somewhere. But I've got a number of Neolithic and Bronze Age finds that I've got from completely out of context places. So places where, for example, there's building spoil where no one can tell you where it was dug up, ploughed fields where it's all been jumbled up for hundreds of years, maybe even millennia. But this one here is the best thing I've ever found, and it probably will always remain the best thing I've ever found. And you don't even know the coolest thing about it yet. I found this in Yorkshire, and can you see it's got quite a distinctive red pattern to it with speckles all over it?
Yeah, it's sort of mottled looking.
If you tried to use this to chop down a tree, it would break. So what's the point in having it?
I don't know.
Well, nor do I. And that's kind of what we have to embrace with these particular stories, is that there is so much we just can't know. But that's not the strangest thing. This particular distinctive red flint does not occur in Yorkshire. In fact, it doesn't even occur in England. This is from Denmark. You're looking
But you
completely left
found it in Yorkshire. That's
Yeah.
wild.
I went up doing a bit of field walking after a very, very heavy thunderstorm. And this was just sitting on top of a ploughed furrow, washed clean by the rain the night before, just sitting there completely intact, and like someone had just placed it there that morning, and it was just clean. So I wonder, like, one interpretation I could have with this: if you owned a beautiful piece of speckly red flint for your axe and your neighbour didn't, is that some sort of bragging rights? You couldn't use it to chop down a tree, but is this a bit like owning a Ferrari and never taking it out the garage because you're worried about breaking it?
Oh yeah, just the act of having it is enough that you're like, oh, sorry, you're using that axe. Oh no,
that's nice.
I got this one from Denmark actually. It's red and speckly. No, I'm not going to use it to chop down trees. No.
No, it's a bit nice that I've got a workaday axe head that I'll use that for, that I can resharpen, and yours is nice. I'm sure it does a really good job, but mine is red, and I don't think that's kind of patronizing these people. I think they would have recognized the beauty of it, and what I've noticed of it is when I first got it, it was slightly darker in its color. I mean, it dried out slightly because it had been exposed to the air for the first time. You can't really conserve that, but it's never faded anymore. It's never degraded anymore. And it's as good as the day that it was made. And it must have taken someone hours to make. And I'm really, really proud that I've got this. I mean, my uncle, who was doing the field walking with me, he called me all sorts of 4-letter words when I found it, because he just couldn't believe that I found this once in a lifetime find. But for me, this is the closest I will ever get to this person, and trying to work out why they owned something that is both so beautiful but also so useless. I try and relate it to why people own beautiful but useless things today, and perhaps they're not so dissimilar.
And I am the queen of owning beautiful but useless things. Do you know, there's absolutely, I would argue that I had a lot in common with the person who owned that red axe head. Useless but very beautiful, and I would have been like, do you want to see my red axe head? And that's not a euphemism.
Yeah,
want to see it?
I think that in a way, perhaps if we could communicate, we'd struggle to relate to an awful lot of things, but there are some things that we just go, no, that's just very human. We can get on board with that. So I thought I'd a little bit of show and tell there, I know, and perhaps you could be able to put that up on the socials or something if I send you some good photographs of it, get a sense of the scale of it. But finding something like that and understanding that that is the closest that you will ever get to a direct contact with that person is just so fascinating, and it's tantalizing because I don't know why it ended up in that field. This is not the sort of item which would be lost. It is an area that has certainly Bronze Age burials associated with it, but this is a ploughed field that was forest until fairly recently, was moorland before that, and it's been ploughed so many times that it's been taken completely out of context, and there's no other in context archaeological remains within hundreds of meters. So, having recorded it with the Portable Antiquities Scheme, they say, well, we've learned about as much as we can from it. It's a beautiful object, enjoy it, but that's as much as we're going to get from it. And you just have to realize how fragile these little clues about the past are. So if you have no further questions, I thought we could have a look at our first of 4 sites. I say 4 sites, I've realized it's 3 now, but I think I mention other ones as we go through. You can tell I've got a bit of a cold, can you?
That's okay. We'll forgive you.
We won't bother editing it out because people know me by now. I'll just own the mistake. Well, we'll have a look at our first site then. And this is West Kennet, Long Barrow. Our first case study today is one that is related in form and age to the chambered tomb at Barclodia de Garres. Situated on the crest of a steep hill near the Kennet Valley in Wiltshire, it commands views towards other prehistoric sites, such as the Avebury Stone Circle, Wansdyke Boundary Monument, and it is near to the largest man-made hill in Britain, Silbury Hill. However, West Kennet Long Barrow predates them all. Seemingly expanded over time and constructed from large sarsen stones, the monument consists of long stone passages, some 12 metres in length, and tall enough along its length for people to stand upright. There are 4 chambers, 2 in each side with a central passage, and similarly sized terminal chambers at its end. The entrance appears to have been partially blocked by the addition of large terminal stones. The whole monument was covered with an earth mound, an impressive 100 metres in length, with a ditch on either side to define it. It is not entirely unique. There are several such monuments in the area, including Wayland's Smithy, accessible along the nearby Ridgeway, one of Britain's oldest roads, perhaps 5,000 years old. Like all of the monuments we will discuss, clearly this was the result of detailed planning, coordination of people from a wide area, and a lot of blood, sweat, and effort. What was so important to these people to justify such an effort? One interpretation is that the dominant ritual of the age was an ancestor cult. Ancestors had been the first to try and tame the landscape through agriculture. Perhaps it was believed that they could influence the world of the living too. Evidence of deposits inside West Kennet and barrows like it suggests that it was periodically occupied, perhaps to commune with the dead or to ask for help. However, evidence at West Kennet and similar monuments suggests funerary and ritual practices that seem bizarre to us, even a desecration. The remains of about 35 individuals have been found in West Kennet. There appears to be no hierarchy of age or gender. Young people, perhaps in their teens, have been found, as have people likely to be in their 60s or 70s. Male and female remains are found in roughly equal numbers. A later deposit, which seems to postdate the others by centuries, appears to consist of a number of young people, including children who died at different times in different places, but were all buried together in one ritual moment. And yet I saved the strangest to last. The bones were not found to be articulated, i.e. they were not whole skeletons. Sometimes the articulated arm of one individual might be found in one chamber, and the head or hip of the same person in another. Different archaeological layers show bones being redeposited on the site over the centuries. It seems that the living visited the tomb to retrieve bones, only to place them back again, later, sometimes much later. The idea of taking an ancestor's bones, using them in some ritual and then returning them is unfamiliar, but for Neolithic communities it shows how the divide between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead could be blurred. It even hints at a time that might have been less hierarchical overall, especially in the ritual sense, and it is clear how venerated women were in prehistoric Europe from the symbols and the art that they left behind. How this worked we can only guess at. However, the blurring of lines between ancestors and the living is a recurring theme. Excavations of some of the roundhouse dwellings, many of which were occupied for hundreds of years, show similar practices, with ancestors not only buried under the floor, but apparently retrieved from time to time for whatever purpose. Some burials in Northumberland suggest that things were taken a stage further. Oddly drilled holes in major bones were identified, and evidence that the bones had been once part of mummified remains. Initially, this puzzled scientists, but eventually they happened upon a possible reason. The bodies appear to have been re-articulated as mummies, with wooden pegs and cord reattaching limbs and joints, while still preserving their movement. Is it possible that ancestors were mummified and kept in the house to be part of the family long after they had departed this life? Just because this seems unusual by modern and European standards, there are in fact modern parallels to this practice elsewhere in the world, so perhaps it is not as unusual as we think. As for West Kennet itself, its size and prominence suggests that not only were the ancestors venerated, they were central to the world of the living too.
I love this so much. I love this so much. And like you said, I'm really glad you said that there are parallels to this all over the world today. So there are cultures, I'm not going to hazard a guess at where because I know I'm going to get it wrong, but there are cultures in the world where, for example, they dig up their dead every year for a big celebration. There are cultures in the world where they mummify their dead and they put them out on like their porch. And you're like, oh, you know, there's dead grandmother all dressed up on her porch. There is nothing wrong with that.
Not at all. Just because it's unusual to sort of people with a Christian background, I mean, culturally speaking, there's nothing to say that there's a right or wrong way of doing it. I think this was a shock to the Victorian antiquarians who started to discover this stuff. But it is a shock in terms of you find this burial ground, you think, oh, these people have put these bodies in this burial ground for, you know, that's it, the end, right? You find out, oh, okay, there's no hierarchy. That's interesting, you know, and then you find out, oh, half of the bodies are scattered around. They're parts in various places. And you think, oh, it looks like they were removed and brought back. And there's a million and one things that they could have been removed for. It could have been as simple as like families, you know, like you said, mummifying their loved ones and having them in the house for a period of time. But it also could have been, you know, ritualistic celebrations of the dead and the veneration of the dead and the worshipping of the dead. And to do that, you physically literally bring them back. You go into your burial mound.
You get their bones, you get their skeleton, you get their remains, whatever it is, and you bring them back.
Or
And I
just a
think
part of them.
or just a part of them. And maybe, I just think, not that I'm promoting anybody going digging up their dead. People will look at you strangely in
They
the
will.
world that we currently live in. But I do think it's a beautiful connection to your loved ones, because often it is really hard to quantify a spiritual connection with somebody, especially when somebody dies. That spiritual connection doesn't feel like enough.
And
And
I think
having like a physical femur, or you know what I mean, a skull or whatever it is, to honor your dead seems so much more tangible.
I think as well that in the way that we have kind of photograph albums that we can look through for reminders about our past and our family's past, they didn't have that. Their connection to their past was through word of mouth. And we've spoken before, so we won't go over it again, about how we've got ethnographic examples of ancient stories, for example, Indigenous Australian stories that have been proved archaeologically and geologically true.
Yeah.
But that sense of the importance of, with an oral tradition that's passed down by word of mouth, of keeping things accurate. What's to say that the material element to that wasn't bringing some physical presence of these people that you're talking about out of these monuments and back into the world of the living per se. And the other thing is, West Kennet containing around 35 individuals. That's not a lot. That really isn't a lot for a monument of that size, and for a monument that had been used for that long. So yeah, sure, some may have decayed into nothing. Some may have been removed and then never taken back to the monument, and they would have been deposited elsewhere. But it seems like these 35 must have been chosen for some special reason. And it isn't that they've been chosen because they reached a particularly grand age, because we have a variety of ages. It isn't that they're necessarily a reflection of a purely patriarchal or indeed matriarchal society. We have those famous kind of Venus figurines that we get from elsewhere in Europe that have also been interpreted as fertility symbols, that are celebrations of femininity. It genuinely seems like more of a cross-section of that society. So why this small number of people were chosen over such a long period to be buried in this place is something that we might never get a hold of. And yet to find that there are potentially lower status examples of this where people are just buried in the home, well, that's where they lived. Why shouldn't that be where they also sleep in death as well?
Yeah.
Much as we might say, well, I don't like the idea of Granny being buried underneath the living room floor. Well, that's because we're not used to it, and that's because that's not the culture that we've grown up in. But for them, maybe that's tremendously comforting.
Yeah, and there's different things that are tremendously comforting, and different things that will make people stop in their tracks and go, sorry, did she just say that out loud?
Yeah.
I probably haven't spoken about this in the podcast, but after Dan died, after they physically removed his body, one of the first things I said was, so when are you bringing him back? Because in Ireland, that's what we do. We have the body in the sitting room and you lay it out for everyone to see. If the body is in a state where that is appropriate, you have a coffin in your sitting room. It's an open coffin. You lay it out for a day and everyone comes to see the body. That's what I was referring to. And the police and everybody else, ambulance, paramedics, coroners, they were all like, no, he's dead. And I was like, no, I know he's dead, but I'm asking you, when are you bringing him back? I don't understand where he's going to be. And everybody was looking at me like I was crazy. And I was like, I wish there was another Irish person here that could just say, no, you're not crazy, but this is just one of our death rituals. This is one of our death rites that we do that I never realized other people found particularly strange. And
you're talking there about a cultural gap, the width of the Irish Sea, and not 6,000 years.
Yes. Which is crazy.
What a perspective. It's so hard to directly connect to cultures that you're not used to. And yet for yourself, it's just the most natural thing in the world.
Yeah. And honestly, the most natural thing in the world. And I've had this conversation numerous times, and I've probably said this bit of it on the podcast. After that realization, my sister and I were talking, and I said to her, do you remember the first time that you saw a dead body? And she was like, no, I don't really. And I was like, yeah, me neither. Because it was normal for us as children that you would go to the funeral and you would go to somebody's wake and you would see their body, and it would be explained to you, they're not sleeping, they are dead. And this is where we come to say goodbye. So I have no recollection of the first time that I saw a dead body. And you would think that would be like a really, ingrained part of your psyche, like this horrific thing, seeing a dead body. No recollection of it.
And yet these ways of behaving, they've all evolved from somewhere, haven't they? And
They have.
what is correct, if you like, to one person is completely and utterly unrelatable to the other. I knew that you'd kind of connect to the kind of cultural aspect of this, and how well you would actually embrace that side of things, even though you have once said to me, no, I want to know all the answers. It really frustrated me. I want to know all the answers, but you don't need to know all the answers. And I think you're starting to get that now.
Maybe.
Just a bit. We'll see how you get on for the rest of it. I think another thing that kind of strikes me with investigating these sorts of sites is how the burial practices, they change and they just flip from one to the other over the course of centuries or even millennia. So if you'll find, for example, that there are times in the early Bronze Age where you get complete inhumations, so burials of entire bodies within chambered tombs, or what they call kist burials, these little stone boxes that you can find up on the moors, which I've mentioned before. And then later on, a few centuries later, you'll find nothing but cremations. And then the early Anglo-Saxon period, you find cremations. In the later Saxon period, you find burials. And then it goes back to cremations. And then throughout the medieval period, it's back to burials again. You think, well, when did they switch over? Did they just say, well, actually, no, it's a desecration to bury the body whole? No, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to set fire to it. And then who was saying, well, why are you setting fire to that? That's a disrespect to the body, and we should instead bury it. Because as normalized as cremation is now, in this country, in Britain, it's only really been gathering in popularity as a ritual for the last 100 years or so. And probably more recently than that it's become really mainstream. We wouldn't notice it because it's a bit like watching a pot boil. You don't realize it's boiling until it's bubbling away. But that cultural shift has been happening in the background all the time. I'm sure it's the same for people in the past too.
It's amazing that it has flipped from one to the other. Yeah. You know, it wasn't like there was a clear linear progression. It's like we buried people, we stopped doing that, and we moved on to cremations. No, it just has gone, undulated through time, which is really interesting.
And speaking of the remains of that, I've already shown you the axe head, haven't I? I've got something else to show you now.
Oh,
now this is something I really can't be sure of, because I found it completely.
This is a dead body. I'm going to have questions.
I just sort of hear me huffing and puffing up the stairs at a moment.
And I'm like, oh, that's nice.
Okay, I'm just going to get my phone. What's your address again? Well, no. This is something that I found completely out of context. Again, this was very close actually to where I found the axe head, but in a completely different context. It was on a big pile of building spoil that had been moved from another location, so no one could tell me anything about it. And I'm not a pottery expert, but that is the rim sherd of what I think is an Iron Age or Bronze Age piece of pottery. The fabric of it is very dog biscuity. It would just fall apart if I tried to crumble it too much. But can you see what's the coloration difference on the inside there?
It's sort of darker.
It's burned.
Of course it is. It's darker.
Yeah, but it's only burned in places. So whether this is a result of how it was fired, which is probably the most likely, it doesn't look like a collared urn that would have been used for a cremation, to be perfectly honest with you. It's probably a result of having been fired in an open fire. But you can still find these ancient bits of pottery from this time, which have the residues of meals, for example, on the inside from the last meal that was cooked in there. Or indeed, if it is from a cremation, you can find the last vestiges of that cremation inside the urn, because once it's gone out of use, I mean, this is just thrown away. Or if it is a cremation, it is very reverently placed in the ground. But again, what more can we take from that? The answer is not a great deal unless we find a whole load of context. So for me, that's an interesting little find that I've rescued from a pile of building spoil.
I see the point of being like, I mean, it could be this.
Yeah.
It could be that. It could be something else. I see the appeal of that.
Yeah. And again, it's that sense of how much connection can you gain to these people. I've just got a couple other things I'm going to show you. I might as well show you them now. In terms of getting an idea of dating these sites, all you've got is the finds. So pottery is the classic one. We're going to come on in a moment to discussions about how archaeologists regularly name prehistoric peoples after the pottery that they find with them. And it seems very reductive, but actually it's quite helpful in terms of finding those distinctions. But I got two arrowheads that I found here within about 10 meters of each other. And there's hundreds of years between them in terms of their design. So one is this little lozenge shape here.
Yeah.
And the other is more of a leaf shape. The flint that made this one, by the way, came from Lincolnshire, and I found it in Yorkshire. So again, it's it's traveled a few miles to get there, but a very good quality of flint. And you think, well, they're found in the same place, but an arrowhead is so ephemeral, you can shoot it and lose it and never see it again. But something that I find more personal is this little object here. And when we're talking about trying to get that personal connection to the people, I can tell you that the person who used this enjoyed using it and was right-handed. You're looking very puzzled.
Yeah, I am very puzzled.
Well, the answer is, if I hold it in my left hand, can you see it's all skew off at an angle?
Yeah.
If I hold it in my right hand, it's completely in line, and you could use it as a little saw. Oh. So this has been made very deliberately as a small right-handed blade. And the reason I say that the person who used this enjoyed using it is, I've looked at it under a magnifying glass, but you can see it just about with the naked eye, is the cutting edge to it is slightly serrated, where they've taken an antler tine and possibly pressed it against a piece of leather on their knee or something, and they've resharpened the edge. Because when this was new, it would have been as sharp as surgical steel, but it does dull over time. So they thought, well, this is a handy little tool. I don't want to get rid of it yet.
They've given it the time to sharpen it and look after it. Wow.
Rather than just knock off another bit of flint and use that, which would have been quicker, they've taken the time to resharpen this one because it must have been something that fitted in their hand so ideally while they were using it. And again, I don't know how this is going to translate on an audio medium, but I'm hoping your reactions tell their own story. And perhaps if we include some photographs on the socials, people can look them up. You'll get a sense for just how human these things are and what a tantalizing glimpse they are into the lives and the quite mundane at time motivations of these people. Who are just going, well, I need to cut this little bit of meat off a bone, or I need to cut this little bit of leather. This tool really works. I'm going to take the time to resharpen this by the fire tonight. I'm going to use it for a few more weeks.
I really like that. That's very human, and that is something that we can all relate to.
I really think it is.
That feeling of like, oh, I could just get something new, but I like this one.
Yeah. Who else has got a favorite pen?
Oh my God. Yeah. I've got certain pens that I just can't use. Like
maybe you're like me. You go to the cutlery drawer and there are certain knives and forks which you will pick out.
Yeah. I've got a fork in my drawer at the moment that's too heavy.
Yeah.
And it really annoys me.
I've just got one that's too blunt. And rather than get rid of it, I just put it back in and say, well, I'll probably need it at some point. But I would only use it as a last resort.
Yeah, it's the last resort fork when everything else is in the wash. Yeah,
absolutely right. And I doubt that these people were much different to that, because for them, this stone, these stone tools that they produced, they took time to do, but this was the way that things were done, and so the skills were there. And you tend to find actually with stone tools, the quality of them to a certain extent gets worse the more recent they are, because as skills tended to move more towards metalworking and more towards using other types of material, people get less skilled in using stone. It becomes much more disposable, and you just go, oh God, I screwed that up, throw it over your shoulder, carry on.
Yeah.
And I've found places where I've been field walking where you find these deposits of just useless bits of flint. But if you understand that there is no naturally occurring flint in that area, that is in itself evidence that somebody thousands of years ago was sat there napping away on a piece of flint, making another tool. And you don't find the tool because they've taken it with them, but you do find the remains of that piece of activity there. And we talk about ghost stories in this podcast all the time, don't we? But these are the sort of ghostly remains that are, you can find them all over the place if you know where you're looking.
Yeah, and it does make you think. You pick that up and you go, shit, thousands of years ago, somebody else had this in their hand. Like an ancient person had this in their hand and was using it to, sharpen their, whatever it is, sharpen their tools, blah, blah, blah. And that's, when you really stop and think about that, that's incredible.
It really is. And I will say, I mean, because otherwise people are bound to put it in the comments, quite obviously, this is the realm of real archaeologists. If you don't know what you're doing, if you're unsure at all, you don't want to be picking stuff up from places like scheduled ancient monuments when you're on holiday or anything like that, because I mean, not only can that get you in masses of trouble, that might remove a crucial clue and a bit of context to something else. All the I'm describing, if they're important, they have been recorded officially through the authorities. I do have some archaeological background from my university work, but they are universally things that are completely out of context, and they're from disturbed deposits and landscapes which are not scheduled. So it's just worth pointing that out before people go charging off and getting themselves potentially into trouble. But speaking of charging off, shall we get on to our second site?
Hey, true crime fans. Tired of ads interrupting your gripping investigations? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. After all, ads shouldn't be the scariest thing about true crime. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free true crime. That's amazon.com/ad-free true crime to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Where'd you get those shoes? Easy. They're from DSW. Because DSW has the exact right shoes for whatever you're into right now. You know, like the sneakers that make office hours feel like happy hour. The boots that turn grocery aisles into runways. And all the styles that show off the many sides of you, from daydreamer to multitasker and everything in between. Because you do it all in really great shoes. Find a shoe for every you at your DSW store or DSW.com.
Hey there. Looking to level up your shopping experience? Let me introduce you to Amazon Live. If you haven't heard, it's a shoppable video experience where influencers and creators showcase the latest must-haves all while you shop in real time. And for those who love some celeb gossip, reality stars like Kyle Richards, Lala Kent, and friend of the pod, Paige DeSorbo. On her new show, In Bed with Paige DeSorbo, Paige invites top-tier guests to cozy up in her fluffy bed where they spill secrets, share nighttime routines, and even whip up midnight snacks. Stream and shop new episodes of her series In Bed with Paige DeSorbo every Tuesday at 7 p.m. ET by going to amazon.com/live/Paige_DeSorbo. Or you can watch Amazon Live's new live TV channel on Freevee or Prime Video under the DIY section and shop along on your phone.
Thumbtack presents the ins and outs of caring for your home. Out. Procrastination, putting it off, kicking the can down the road. In. Plans and guides that make it easy to get home projects done. Out. Carpet in the bathroom? Like why? In. Knowing what to do, when to do it, and who to hire. Start caring for your home with confidence. Download Thumbtack today.
Situated amidst the rough and foaming seas where the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea and Arctic collide, the Isles of Orkney are apparently remote to the rest of the British Isles. However, the culture that clearly thrived here 5,000 years ago has surprising parallels with people and monuments hundreds of miles away. The complex borders and history of these islands can seem to arbitrarily divide us, but these divisions seem less apparent thousands of years ago. Orkney remains comparatively undeveloped to this day, meaning the ancient monuments and the remains of settlements are incredibly well preserved, and at times, still being rediscovered. In 1850, a deadly storm swept down from the north. Towering waves scoured out a knoll of earth on the Orcadian coast, revealing the long-buried remains of a Stone Age village. Excavated in stages ever since, the settlement at Skara Brae provided an incredible insight into prehistoric life, but at times seemed to be incredibly familiar. Neat, partly buried houses with a central hearth, stone-enclosed beds that would have held furs and heather for comfort, and even shelves and dressers that would hardly look out of place in a Victorian farmhouse. Here was a slice of Neolithic life laid bare, and all of a sudden, people felt that they could relate to these long-dead people. In the way that they do, the archaeologists categorise these people by the material culture that they left behind, the smooth pottery with distinctive engraved decorations, and so they became known as the grooved ware. We could imagine them cooking on their fires, tending to the sick and elderly in their beds, eating the local oysters and seabirds and putting their pottery on the dresser. This was the life, apparently, of the grooved ware culture and grooved ware people. What none of this can reveal, however, is what these people were actually thinking. What were their beliefs? What did they believe controlled the world? And what came after death? The purpose and order of their dwellings was apparently easy, even common sense to interpret. But what drove these people to build monuments of such ambition, enormity, and precision? Within a 2-mile area of central Orkney is a UNESCO World Heritage Site called the Heart of Neolithic Orkney. Within this area are a number of settlements, burials, and megalithic monuments of international importance. They seem to be roughly contemporary and would have required hundreds of thousands of man-hours of work to complete, in an enterprise comparable in both scale and precision to any of the great pyramids of ancient Egypt. These include the chambered tomb of Maes Howe, the settlement at Barnhouse, and the henge monuments of the Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stennis. Overlooking these at the opposite end of a thin isthmus of land, acting like a natural causeway, are many other standing stones and burial mounds in a ritual landscape of incredible complexity. So what can it all mean? We will first consider the stone circles and henges. Firstly, a henge is not necessarily what you think it is. A henge may have a formation of stones within it, but more commonly they do not. Sometimes they have one entrance, sometimes two, but rarely more. Defensive enclosures like hill forts typically have a ditch on the outside and a bank on the inside, topped with a wall or palisade fence. These are designed to keep unwanted people out. Henges are the opposite. They have banks on the outside and ditches inside, enclosing the God knows what. It is almost as if the henges are enclosing a sacred space. Rather than keeping people out, perhaps they are keeping spirits in. At the northwestern end of the isthmus is the stone circle called the Ring of Buchan, but far more impressive, in the middle of the natural causeway, is the Ring of Brodgar. At the southeastern end are the stones of Stennis. The Ring of Brodgar is set within a broad ditch with 27 enormous standing stones arranged in a circle 104 metres in diameter. Originally, there were 60 stones. Some of these have fallen, others likely carried away over the millennia for building stone. Beyond this is this henge is a buried wall that has been excavated reasonably recently and dated to the same age. Seemingly spanning the whole of the Ness of Brodgar and around 100 metres long, it is as if this wall separated the landscape into ritual zones. To the southeast is the smaller, but more ancient still, circle called the Stones of Stennis. Although the banks and ditches have eroded, these stones also stood within a henge monument. One is 44 metres wide, with one entrance pointing towards the settlement at Barnhouse. The stones, up to 5 metres in height, are only about 1 foot deep into the ground, with deliberately shaped, sloped tops. It may be the oldest such henge in the entire British Isles. Often, such stone circles give tantalising clues as to their purpose or function, as they have intricate astrological or solar alignments. Perhaps they were ritual calendars, a sign of the significance of the passing seasons for the agricultural year and survival. And yet the stone circles of Orkney have no such alignments whatsoever. Tempting as it may be to suppose that these Orcadians lacked the sophistication of later peoples building monuments like Stonehenge, the next and perhaps most famous site gives the lie to this idea. Maze Howe, less than a mile from the Stones of Stennis, is a chambered tomb that on first description might remind you of the West Kennet Long Barrow or other chambered tombs, but it is far more enigmatic than that, and perhaps to describe it as a tomb is entirely inaccurate. 115 feet or 35 metres in diameter, and covered with earth and grass, the construction does not appear to be that sophisticated, but appearances are deceptive. A series of chambers and passageways constructed from wide slabs of stone lie underneath. The precision of the engineering, which terminates in a high, precisely vaulted stone ceiling covering a terminal chamber, rivals that of the pyramids at Giza. Sometime in the 9th century, Viking raiders looted Maze Howe. They were at least good enough to engrave on its stones a long runic inscription to bear witness to the fact, and this is what the description actually reads. Earl Harold set out from Orkney at Christmas with 4 ships and 100 men. He lay for 2 days off Grimsay, and then in at Hamnavo on Hrossay, which means mainland Orkney. And on the 19th day of Christmas, they travelled on foot to Firth. During a snowstorm, they took shelter on Orkahaur, which was the Viking name for Maze Howe. And from there, 2 of them went insane, which slowed them down badly, so that by the time they reached the Firth, it was night time. I like the idea of these Vikings going insane, but perhaps realistically, it's just another way of saying that they got lost. As well as getting lost themselves, what was actually lost from Maze Howe in this raiding can never sadly be known. The names of Orkney and Shetland, and indeed these monuments, are heavily influenced by the Norse peoples. In the 18th century, it was even supposed that they must in some way be related to the rituals of the Norsemen, with reference to Odin stones and Thor still common. However, these estimates of age are out by at least 4.5 millennia. The reality of Maze Howe might be even more fascinating than the mythology attached to it. With its long central passageway, chamber at the end, and smaller chambers fanning out from the entrance, perhaps this place was another location where the remains of the venerated dead were deposited and where people sought the help of the ancestors. However well looted, though, it would be expected that some trace of this might remain, and yet none of this has been found. No evidence of human or animal remains, no evidence of ritual burning, no evidence of burial. The place seems so much more sterile than other places. This provides another tantalising theory as to its purpose: a solar observatory calendar. To enter the main chamber, one must crouch or crawl as if prostrate before a great power. Having crawled along an almost 10-metre long entrance passageway, the interior is understandably dark and shadowy. That is, except at one special time of the year. For 3 weeks either side of the midwinter solstice, the rays of the setting sun shine directly into the entrance passage, illuminating the chamber at the end with increasing or waning strength depending on how far from the solstice the sun is setting. And then, on the day of the midwinter solstice itself, the light fully floods the end chamber, bathing it in a golden light, as if the dark encasing stones were not there at all. One theory is that the chambers were for some ritual attached to this significant moment, perhaps holy men or women whose role was to mark the passing of the year. At Orkney's latitude, the winter nights are very cold and very long, and so the promise of longer hours of daylight and a renewal and rebirth of life in the coming year was doubtless a cause of significance, even if we cannot prove the celebrations or relief that was attached to this. However, the alignments do not end there. On the sunset of the winter solstice, not only do the sun's rays shine into the entranceway, they also align precisely with a standing stone half a mile distant at Barnhouse Settlement. The precise cutting, measuring, laying, and aligning of so many stones, some 3 tons in weight, we can only marvel at. Finally, the settlement of Barnhouse itself was excavated in the 1980s. The very unromantically named Structure 8 at Barnhouses has a partially destroyed entrance that also aligns precisely with the entrance at Maze How, and therefore it aligns with the midsummer sunrise, marking as it does the harvest time and the gradual return of longer, colder nights. All this achieved without any modern ranging or surveying equipment. When your project timescale can stretch into generations of people, one can afford to take the time to be precise. All this suggests that the ritual landscape of remote Orkney was related intimately to the passing seasons and landscapes of both the living and the ancestors. Yet was it really that remote? Well, consider these coincidences. The chamber tomb at Newgrange, Eastern Ireland, also has a passageway that aligns precisely with the midwinter sunset, illuminating the terminating chamber. Not yet convinced? Well, the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney, Newgrange Circle in Ireland, and Avebury Stone Circle in Wiltshire, England, all measure 104 metres across. Perhaps this is less spooky, and more the result of sophisticated lines of trade, communication, and cultural similarity that perhaps linked these otherwise distant peoples.
Sorry, my little face. I forget that people can't see me. I'm just full of joy.
I've mentioned Newgrange, I knew you'd love that.
Yeah, and I just find it fascinating because, like you said, this was a generational project.
Yeah.
This wasn't something that a load of fellas could do over a summer.
No.
Like, it took so much time to get the precision spot on, that the passages would light up at the right time, that the alignment would with the standing stone would happen. Like, that is like properly, mathematical, and they really had to put the work in to be able to do that. That in itself is insane. Yeah. That you're thinking, right, this project is going to take a long time. We're talking generations to get this right.
The people starting it know that they're not going to see the finish of it. And it's not something that's a multi-phased site like, dare I say, Stonehenge, but just one site. But that was true of cathedrals as well in more recent times, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Have I ever taken you around Canterbury Cathedral?
Yeah, we did we go around Canterbury Cathedral? We did a walking tour of Canterbury. You toured me around, we did a walking tour. Yeah. I can't remember if we went into the cathedral or not, though. The
sense you get in there of saying, well, this phase is Norman, this phase is late Middle Ages, and this phase is Tudor. It seems really obvious to us that these are things that have been added on almost like home improvements on a grand scale. But here we've got single sites where someone's had to say, right, this is the plan, and it's going to take us 2 or 3 generations to do it. Oh, and by the way, we can't write any of this stuff down because there's no writing.
And also, what I was thinking about is, imagine being the person, whether it was like a lay person or an archaeologist, whoever, who suddenly went, oh my God, this lights up on the winter solstice? Shut up! And then they'd have to wait for another year to make sure that it was actually like a purposeful thing, rather than just, oh, maybe it was just this year or whatever. Imagine being those people to be like, and also, all of these other sites are 104 meters, and all of these other sites line up with the winter solstice. And They must have just been like completely mind blown.
Must have been. And I think about those Vikings who maybe took shelter in there as well. I mean, 13 days after Christmas would put it maybe 3 weeks after the midwinter solstice. So
Yeah.
maybe the light wasn't shining in quite so much there, but maybe they knew something about it. Maybe there was some sort of folk history there with it. But the fact that that's the only inscription, or the earliest inscription we've got associated with this site, and it's 4.5 millennium out, it just shows you how
crazy,
how long ago this was. It really is mad, isn't it?
I was watching this thing yesterday on TikTok, and I have a personal hatred of stories about like ancient aliens and stuff, because they're so often linked with racist ideals and whatever. And this video came up of a person being like, "Were the pyramids built with lasers?" And this guy was debunking it, right? He was just like you. He was like, "No, they weren't."
No, obviously not. Anyway, next.
And it was all about like how accurate they were and how level they were, blah, blah, blah. And the guy was like, "Yeah, have you ever heard of water? They likely flooded the plains to get the level, like, because the water would settle at and show you the level of the ground. And then from there you could design, your building to be perfectly level. That's all. It's not lasers. Like, these people were intelligent. They weren't being helped by aliens."
Yeah, I mean, the fact that our new build houses have got things that are out of whack is because we're chucking them up with very little thought and for very little money. This is something where they're saying, look, we will get this right. It could take us our entire lives, but we will get this right. And I personally had always assumed for years, until I looked into it in more detail, that the stones on Orkney would have these astrological alignments like others do. And the fact that they didn't really surprise me, because you can even find very minor stone circles in places like Dartmoor that have really quite precise astrological alignments. But it seems more that they are just built for the ceremony and the spectacle of it, and for some ritual reason that we simply can't understand. And yes, I'm very well aware that ritual is a bit of a byword for archaeologists just saying, "I don't know." Yeah. And that's fine. Because it's always ritual. You don't understand it, it's always ritual. But this is it. That's the abstract thing that you cannot unlock from these long dead minds, can you?
No, and it is. I just think the genius of it all is so fascinating.
Like, it really is.
The genius of these people with fucking no, they're not writing things down. Like, they have no comprehension of like maths in the way that we know it now, and they're building these spectacular monuments, first of all, and then they're building things that are, have these alignments and connections with other monuments all over the British Isles. Hats off to those guys.
Yeah, and the fact that the original plans were made by people who were maybe long dead when it was finished, and yet just by speaking about it, they can still say, "No, this is exactly what we are doing." Whether we can be really sure that it was that precise, I'm not sure, but the evidence would seem to speak for itself when the alignments are still really apparent to us today, and they still work, essentially.
They still work.
Which, of course, I think leads us on to my third and final site. And have I left the most controversial and most famous for last? Ooh. I think you know where I'm talking about, don't you?
Are you talking about Stonehenge?
I'm totally talking about Stonehenge. Should we get into it?
Yeah, before you start, I've seen Stonehenge a lot lately. Randomly.
From the road, though, yeah?
Yeah, from the road. I've not gone in, right? And it's so funny when you're driving past Stonehenge, the traffic immediately builds up because everybody's slowing down to look, to just stare at Stonehenge. Yeah, I've seen it loads recently. I haven't actually been to it, been up to the stones. But yeah, it's big. It's, as you can imagine, it's just like.
But it's not as big as you think it's going to be, is it?
No, but I feel that about everything. I went to see the Niagara Falls and I was like, oh, is that it? They're not that big. I don't know what I was expecting in my head, to be honest. But
I think when I saw Niagara Falls, I had the right thing in mind, that I didn't really set myself up for disappointment. And I was really impressed at how big they were, especially when we went underneath them. But I'm always mindful of the fact, last time I was in Kent, actually, when I was walking up over the cliffs towards Deal, I could see the cross-channel ferries going out. And I was very mindful of that, saying those cross-channel ferries are bigger than the Titanic. And yeah, we got this idea that Titanic was some all-encompassing Leviathan. I said, well, it was at the time, but these days, oh, that's a reasonably big ferry. It's unfair,
I
isn't
saw
it?
A cruise ship probably for the first time. I've never seen a cruise ship up close.
Yeah.
I saw it when I was in Malta. Like, it was cruising out of the harbour, and I was like, that thing. It was like, it blew my mind how big it was. I just don't think I had fully comprehended how big cruise ships actually are.
Yeah, they are just gigantic. How did we get onto Titanic and cruise ships?
Sorry, go on,
Stonehenge?
tell your story about
It was
Stonehenge.
all about comparisons of size, wasn't it? Okay, well, we are going to go on to Stonehenge last time, and I think everyone's got at least some knowledge of this monument, and everyone's got some idea and theories about it. Well, I'm going to try and dig into some of those, but actually try and get some certainty as far as we can about the people who may have built it. I have left the most famous and perhaps most enigmatic for last. I suspect by the time I have typed these carefully chosen words, our understanding of Stonehenge will have already changed. The scale of Stonehenge might not be as huge as you think. The largest stones from the latest phase of construction, although not the largest on the site, are 4 metres tall above the ground, though they would have still been colossal to move. The stones form a monument about 30 metres in diameter, with a henge ditch about 110 metres wide, similar again to nearby Avebury and the more remote Newgrange and Ring of Brodgar. It remains a spiritually important site, and this lends a complexity to its conservation. How does one preserve it, while still allowing it to be experienced by the public and keeping it accessible to the very many people who still deeply hold a spiritual connection to the site and feel a sense of simultaneous ownership and belonging? Who built Stonehenge? Well, for once, we actually have some idea. It seems the earliest earthworks were constructed in about 3100 BC, forming a henge in a location already significant to the midsummer sunrise, with evidence of a timber Mesolithic site nearby. The landscape around Stonehenge contains hundreds of burial mounds, and the remains of those buried there have been rigorously dated, with DNA and isotope analysis done on the bones and teeth. The original Neolithic builders of Stonehenge were genetically very similar to people from elsewhere in the Iberian and Northern Europe, including modern-day Spain and France. However, the main stone constructions seem to be associated with a culture known as the Beaker people. Here we are again with archaeologists naming a culture of people after the pots that they left behind for us. For a time it was supposed that the people found buried with distinctive Beaker pottery were imitating the cultural fashions of Iberian Europe. However, more recent scientific analysis has proved this to be mistaken. This was a cultural takeover. These people genetically originated in the Iberian Peninsula and migrated to the British Isles, bringing with them new pottery and, in a truly revolutionary change, metalworking. And so Stonehenge and its construction was a combined effort of many peoples from the Neolithic to the early Bronze Age in about 2500 BC. With minor adjustments even as late as 1600 BC. About 90% of the population of the British Isles eventually culturally and genetically assimilated with these Beaker folk, a point which may explain some of the similarities between the monuments that we have so far investigated. The collaboration involved in building it is beyond doubt. While the largest stones, called the Sarsens, are relatively local, being sourced within a few miles on Salisbury Plain, moving 40 to 50 ton blocks of worked stone was possible, but challenging. The smaller bluestones were proven to have come from the Preseli Hills in Wales. That is remarkable in and of itself, given the effort to move them over 100 miles. But in recent years, it has been argued that the bluestones at Stonehenge possibly originated in a stone circle monument in Wales that was then dismantled and moved to their present site. Although this interpretation has been very recently challenged. But the origins of them having been quarried in West Wales is beyond doubt. Most incredibly, just a few short weeks before I typed these words and researched this, it was proved that the so-called altar stone was not in fact from Wales. It had come from over 400 miles away in northeast Scotland. This places it a metaphorical stone's throw from the monument on Orkney, with which it shares some common geological footprints. The links between these prehistoric peoples grow with every new discovery. The monument then consists of phases of construction. First, the henge earthworks were constructed, with a circle of Welsh bluestones placed within it. The holes from these stones remain buried, but the stones themselves were reset after a phase, just as well, for in the holes were found the cremated bones of over 60 individuals. As at West Kennet, roughly half were men, half were women. Next, the bluestones were rearranged, and the main entrance widened. The following phase was one of the most dramatic. 30 or so gigantic sarsen stones were placed around the outside, with horizontal lintels placed on them, with intricately engineered mortise and tenon or tongue and groove joints. Within these was a horseshoe formation of great stone trilithons, each almost 7 metres tall, with almost 8 metres below ground, these weighing some 50 tons. Several adjustments and additions were made in the Bronze Age too, with faint graffiti engravings visible on the central trilithons that, having been laser scanned, appeared to be accurate representations of Bronze Age weapons. The site, it seems, was active as a sacred place for as much as 1,500 years. What can Stonehenge tell us about the beliefs of those who built it? We seem again to be relating this to the idea of a landscape of the living versus a landscape of the dead, an idea posed by Mike Parker Pearson, a leading Stonehenge expert. Stonehenge should be viewed in the context of the whole landscape. Stonehenge has very precise and obvious alignments to the sun, most famously the summer solstice sunrise. On Midsummer's Day, the sun rises over the so-called heel stone outside the main henge monument, aligned with stones. The winter solstice sunset is arranged to the southwest too. Its use as an observational calendar seems very clear, but the significance of this can never be known for sure. Very recently, investigations into lunar alignments gathered pace too. Increasing evidence that there are lunar alignments over a 56-year cycle are apparent, including a generational movement where there is a lunar standstill every 18.6 years. Neolithic people seem to have understood all of these movements and attached significance to them. One interpretation is that these alignments represent the birth and death of the yearly cycle and sun, relating this to the death and celebration of the ancestors. This is not just empty supposition, but has some circumstantial support. Stonehenge does not sit alone. There are 2, possibly 3 processional trackways nearby. These monuments are known as cursus monuments. One leads directly from Stonehenge in the direction of the River Avon, which would have been the Neolithic equivalent of a highway. Evidence of massive fires suggests that at certain times of the year, people gathered here from far and wide. Processional cursus monuments exist all over Britain. The largest known one is in nearby Dorset and stretches over 6 miles and seems associated with a number of barrow cemeteries. The other known and complete cursus is to the north of Stonehenge and leads directly to the Neolithic settlement enclosed by the banks and ditches of Durrington Walls. Calling this a settlement seems a disservice. It may have held as many as 1,000 dwellings and 4,000 people at its height. In the context of such a small population, this is more likely a Stone Age city. In 2024, so very recently, it was announced that a further ring of massive pits had been identified around Durrington Walls, a huge 1.2 miles across. Little else is known about this new discovery, but more will be learned. Finally, south of Durrington Walls was the remarkable discovery of another henge monument, this time set with monumental tree trunks. Predictably, this became known as Woodhenge, and its alignments are a mirror to Stonehenge, and their relationship seems certain. While Stonehenge aligns to the winter solstice sunrise, Woodhenge aligns with the summer solstice sunrise. Mike Parker Pearson sees this as a reflection of the spiritual duality in Neolithic belief. Durrington Walls, Woodhenge, and the sites by the River Avon represent a land of the living. Stonehenge and the many burials and mounds to the west represent a landscape of the dead. The cursus monuments allow for a ritual journey between the two. Consider how we still use processional ways, long and short, in modern times, and it all seems to make much more sense. Many Christians are carried through a church towards the font by the door. Later in life, they walk up the aisle to be married, and at the end, many are carried the opposite way and out to a place of burial. Physically representing transitions between stages of life and death seem as natural to us as any other tradition. Having considered the alignments, the context, and the possible purposes of Stonehenge, then what is left to consider? Well, plenty, as it goes. Within the last few decades, a hypothesis has been advanced to suggest that Stonehenge was a place of healing too. There is evidence for this in the bones of those found literally in the ditches and banks of the monument, and those buried in the barrow cemeteries around. Evidence of chronic illness are surprisingly common in these burials. Perhaps the most surprising element is where these people originally came from. This suggests that Stonehenge was famous across the continent and acted as something of a place of pilgrimage too. A number of so-called archer burials have been found. They take this name from the grave goods found with them, typically a beaker vessel, arrowheads like the ones I showed earlier, hunting tools, and flint daggers. One such grave of a teenage boy was found in the monument itself. Strontium isotope analysis of his teeth show that he grew up in the Mediterranean, but he died at or near Stonehenge. Another pair, the Boscombe Bowman, came from either Wales or the Lake District in northern England. However, the most famous and most tantalising is the Amesbury archer. This figure had an incredibly rich selection of grave goods: arrowheads, beaker vessels, stone and metalworking kits, a stone wrist guard for archery, and even some of the earliest gold objects discovered in England. He was in his 40s when he died, but he had lived a tough life. He had a tooth abscess, missing kneecap, and spinal abnormalities. He would have been in pain and discomfort and limping before he passed, and perhaps came to Stonehenge for healing. Nearby, a companion grave was found, of a man in his 20s. Both skeletons shared a rare genetic abnormality in their skeletons, which highly suggested that they were related, possibly father and son. However, strontium isotope analysis of the teeth suggests something very remarkable. The Amesbury archer grew up in the Western Alps. The companion grew up in Wessex, England, but moved and lived in the Western Alps at some point as well. Both died and were buried at Stonehenge. Were this not evidence enough of the cultural links of the Neolithic? Evidence of feasting and celebrations have revealed the remains of animals. Marks on the bones show that they were butchered for meat. Analysis of the teeth show that some were herded from as far away as Scotland to be eaten for some great gathering of people. The physical efforts to build Stonehenge and the evidence of how people travelled to it show just how important ritual life was, in death and life, and how organised, linked and sophisticated these people were. This brings us to more modern interpretations. Victorian antiquarians equated the culture that created Stonehenge to the Druidic peoples. The Druids were a religious oligarchy that existed in the Iron Age, particularly in Wales and in the extremities of the British Isles. We can be more certain of them and their practices, as the Romans, whilst largely antagonistic towards them, recorded their encounters with them in surviving historical accounts. Such interpretations have since been debunked to the tune of 2 millennia or so. Another popular idea is the existence of the associated ley lines. These are supposed lines of energy that show impossible alignments across hundreds of miles that incorporate significant sites such as boundary ditches, standing stones, and henges across both the miles and the ages. I hate to sound dismissive, but personally speaking, I've never really got on with this idea. There are so many such sites in the British Isles, and indeed the world, that finding these alignments is comparatively easy. One could just as easily plot out the branches of a particular coffee brand and discover similar patterns and alignments. However, this belief remains an inspiration for some, and I'll feel very silly if I'm proved wrong. Today, Stonehenge is a magnet for neo-pagans and modern druids. Increasing numbers of people throughout the 20th century and into the 21st have sought to reconnect with ancient nature-based beliefs and rituals. This is not something I can claim to have experienced, nor something that I'm very knowledgeable about, but I'll offer this thought. Seeing hundreds, sometimes thousands of people rejoicing and engaging with the monument at the summer solstice is an image that I find quite powerful and beautiful. Concerns over damage to the genuinely fragile monument, and let's be honest, probably some snobbery too, have brought different groups to be at odds with each other over this famous landmark. Neo-pagans and spiritualists have clashed with authorities, seeking to limit their access to it. A 1985 court injunction sought to stop a summer solstice gathering, leading to clashes between police and New Age groups seeking access to Stonehenge in what became known as the Battle of the Beanfield. Government and official agencies have at some times threatened these monuments, at other times protected them. Stonehenge originally sat on private land, but was gifted to the nation in 1915. It is now under the expert guardianship of English Heritage, a non-profit trust that seeks to protect the monument and balance this with access and education for the public. Pressures of the modern world increasingly press on Stonehenge. The demands of the First World War led to the creation of an airfield immediately next to it. This provided some of the first aerial photographs of Stonehenge, but the hangars ruined the sacred skyline, until of course they were taken down. For a long time, Stonehenge stood between two busy roads, but the closer of the two was closed to protect it. Even still, the A303 still runs south of Stonehenge. Many people's only experience of the monument is being stuck in traffic on this inadequate trunk road to the summer resorts in the West Country. A plan to alleviate this and increase capacity involved the building of a tunnel to bypass the monument. Proponents argued that journeys would be less disrupted and the peace and original skyline of the landscape would be restored. Others, including, to be perfectly clear, the vast bulk of historians and archaeologists, were horrified by this. knowing that the excavations would destroy untold archaeology and the true topography of the landscape, among other things. As of 2024, this plan now appears to have been scrapped. Referring to the proposed tunnel, Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man one, the historian, said that to inflict this act of vandalism on the landscape seems almost unbelievable. However, vandalism is nothing new. Stones simply vanished in the 17th and 18th centuries to be broken into building stone. Victorian tourists chiselled off chunks as souvenirs. In 2008, a chunk was pulled off one of the sarsen stones by 2 visitors to the site, and in June 2024, it was sprayed with water-soluble orange paint by the Just Stop Oil protest group. Whatever one's opinion of such tactics, they knew that such an act at Stonehenge would attract huge attention, and they were right. Each threat to the stones leads to more arguments to restrict access. Each argument to restrict access risks removing our ability to visit and experience the monument and understand it. Here, in the modern world, we see divide after divide. Who does Stonehenge belong to? English heritage? The government? King Charles? New Age, neo-pagan or neo-druidic groups? The people of Britain? The people of the world? All these competing claims exist in a state of some tension. Yet perhaps this distracts us from a possible ancient unity. This is shown in the ancient stones of these islands. Parallels in apparent burial practices without distinctions of age or gender. Similarities in sizes, function and engineering from Newgrange to Orkney. The gathering and transport of stones from all over these islands to be installed at Stonehenge, and then celebrated or venerated by people from not only Britain, but across Europe. Perhaps in these respects, the people of the Neolithic and Bronze Age could teach us a thing or two about slowing down, listening, and sharing what we have while we still can.
Can I just say, right, if you are somebody who goes to an ancient site and fucking chisels off a bit of it to bring home with you, you're a knob.
Yeah, I mean, blatantly.
Like, you're just a
Even
knob.
in the Victorian times, people would say you're being a dick.
Yeah, even then they were like, no, don't do that. Like, this is our heritage.
If we all do that, it's not going to be here anymore.
I used to work with a girl who went around documenting ancient graffiti, which is pretty cool job. So she was able, you know, if we were in the cathedral or whatever, she was able to say, oh no, that graffiti is actually ancient. That is just some modern knob that's done that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, so if you do that, don't do that.
I love this idea of them engraving really accurate pictures of tools and things on there, which we can still scan with lasers and just about make out with the naked eye as well. I mean, there must have been a reason why they were doing that, and they must have been very deeply incised to still be there after all these millennia of weathering of the stones as well.
I wonder if it's possible that was literally just like, this is what we used.
It could be. Or whether
if these were generation-long projects, like generations-long projects, where they like, look, we use this for this and we found it really useful. So, you know, we're going to carve it in so that people know what to use for this particular bit.
And to sound like a true archaeologist, maybe there is some ritual significance as well. I mean, who's to say that metalworking in and of itself was not some pseudo-religious action in and of itself? This idea that you could take rocks and produce from them metals with all the fire and sparks and everything else that comes with it. It is kind of magical, isn't it? I mean, think about the sword from the stone. That's kind of what you're doing with iron, isn't it?
I love the idea of people coming together at Stonehenge and having these big rituals, like big fire rituals. We know there was animal bones that were found. Like, it must have been people from miles around coming together to be like, it's that time of year again.
Yeah.
You gotta go to Stonehenge.
We all know why we're coming. This is something that binds us together, even if we don't have any other. Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful. And this idea of these gigantic pits being found around Durrington walls, they remind me of an enormous version of something called a causewayed enclosure, which is possibly the most enigmatic of Neolithic monuments that you could have. Have you heard of a causewayed enclosure before?
I don't think I have.
It's really hard to describe without drawing it, but imagine concentric ditches, but instead of those ditches being entire ditches with no entranceways, they've got these regular interruptions and gaps, which more turns them into a series of pits that make a ring. Well, the gaps between them, those are the causeways or entrances to them, and we find them all over England, and often they're, and in fact further afield, and often they are associated with other landscapes. Sometimes the landscapes are reused, and they've still got some sort of ritual significance today as churches or whatever else. But we haven't got the faintest idea what they're for and why they were built. and why they've got so many entrances. We just don't know. So whether in the fullness of time we'll look at Durrington Walls and this is the causeway enclosure to end all causeway enclosures, because typically they're maybe 50, 60, 100 metres wide, but 1.2 miles? And I don't know whether you read that the pits that they found, the sides to them are vertical. So it's not like they've been dug out in a V shape and then piled somewhere else. They've got these vertical sides to them, which also sounds incredibly unusual. I mean, this is something I'll definitely be keeping my ear to the ground about in the coming years and decades as we find out more. Even though I do kind of accept that we'll just never know the truth, will we?
I wrote down as well that I just loved the Battle of the Beanfield.
Oh, isn't that a great name?
Just in general, what a great name.
Yeah, it really is. By the way, what did you think of the Amesbury Archer and possibly his son being buried next to each other?
Well, I'd written down the Amesbury Archer. First of all, right, I've written down Amesbury Archer and missing kneecap.
Yes.
Holy Mother of Divine. Like, I've never had an abscess in my tooth, but I've heard they're absolutely horrendous.
I have, and I wouldn't recommend it.
I've heard that the pain is absolutely unbearable because there's no escaping from it. And you've got a missing kneecap. And I really enjoyed, I never knew that Stonehenge was possibly a place to go for healing.
Quite possibly.
That's really interesting. And I think it's really fascinating that this man and his son potentially were both buried there, because it shows how important Stonehenge was as a place, not just to local people, but to people from far away, people almost like a pilgrimage, like to go and be like, I'm going to go get healed, or I'm going to go for this big, whatever it is, solstice ritual that we do. It clearly was a place of great significance even then. And I love the fact, to be honest, that the stones have come from all over the British Isles. I think that's really beautiful and poetic and lovely.
Yeah. And it's such a show of collaboration between these peoples who, I mean, who knows whether they share the language or other cultural similarities, but we keep on coming across this idea that there are more similarities between these sites than there are differences. And some of those similarities, they actually go across centuries of time as well. I think it's without question that the Amesbury Archer is a very high status individual because of the gold objects and things found with him.
Yeah.
But this missing kneecap, that had been missing for some time. So...
Oh, it gives me the heebie-jeebies.
The idea that someone with a missing kneecap could travel possibly from the Western Alps to Stonehenge, it's beyond belief, isn't it? I mean,
how are you getting there? How are you physically getting there?
Let's be honest, with a lot of help, probably. And
if he was a rich man, then probably,
Yeah, with a lot of help. But this, I mentioned a couple of times, almost as a throwaway, this strontium isotope analysis of the teeth.
Yeah, I did enjoy that.
Probably shouted at by archaeologists everywhere for oversimplifying it. But essentially, the water that you drink while your adult teeth are coming in is sort of imprinted within the teeth, and it can be analysed. And that gives a reasonably approximate location for where you were living at that particular time. Which
I think is really fascinating, isn't it? Like how...
Oh, it's so cool.
I do love when you're watching archaeology things and they're like, we can tell by their bones that they, this was primarily what their diet was. Like, I loved that when they found Richard III's skeleton and they were like, he drank liters of wine every day.
Well, wouldn't you if you got the chance?
I mean, probably not, because I get terrible hangovers. So.
Yeah, but the quality of the water back then, you wouldn't want it. I mean, it's a bit of a myth that people never drank water back then. Of course they did, because it was cheap, it was available, and there were good sources of it. But, wine and beer, that was an important part of your diet. And I'm sure it was the same for these ancient peoples as well.
I really think it is fascinating. Although I do think out of all of the ones that we've looked at today, I think it's probably the least fascinating for me.
Is it because you already know so much about it?
Not necessarily. I think potentially that, but also potentially because I can see how it was a meeting place for people to do rituals, etc., etc. And I don't think that's particularly mysterious.
I do think that it seems that we argue about it far more today than they necessarily did back then as well. They seem to agree about it a little bit more with all this collaboration. I'll be honest with you, the stones themselves of Stonehenge, they aren't the bit that really fascinates me. It's all the, not coincidental, but associated monuments around it and this evidence of people coming from all over and the rituals and the animal bones and all that. And in a sense, I could almost put my thumb over Stonehenge on the map and be just fascinated and absorbed by everything around it.
Yeah.
And if anyone's listening to this and they don't really understand what we're talking about in terms of this context, I do urge you to look up an archaeological map of the area. You can even see it on Google Maps if you really want to. But if you get a simple archaeological map of the area and see where these Cursors procession ways are and see where Durrington Walls was in relation to Stonehenge, then you can understand so much more what an absolute theme park of, to use a very crass sort of modern term, what a theme park of ritual this place must have been. It must have been utterly incredible at the time, and it's still kind of incredible to us now, isn't it? It's somewhere that I definitely want to know more about. So that's kind of our conclusion now, isn't it?
Tim, that was, as I thought, really fascinating.
I don't quite know how we spent almost an hour and a half on it, but
I don't know how we have either. But I'm just going to add, because I've written this down, right? I don't know why I wrote it down. It obviously popped into my head while you were talking. It's nothing to do with Stonehenge or any of that. Historically, there were a lot more mummies, and a lot of them have disappeared. And I think a lot of people don't know why they've disappeared. Mummies were 10 a penny for a while.
Mm. Well, are you asking me where they've gone? Because I'm not. They're not in my loft or anything.
Well, have you been consuming them like people did in times gone past?
I have not been consuming mummies. I mean, if I had been, would I have a cold right now? Because apparently they've got such miraculous healing properties. Maybe I need a trip to Stonehenge and I'll get over this man flu.
So it's funny how we're like squeamish about death and the dead now, and a lot of people still would have been in this period of time that I'm talking about, because it was the Victorians, wasn't it?
It was really, yeah.
That it was very in vogue to consume bits of mummified people, particularly from Egypt, because they were considered to have fantastic healing properties, which is wild. That's why we have a lot less mummies than we potentially should have, because we were eating them.
I think this is a PSA. Don't eat mummified bodies.
No, wouldn't recommend. No.
It's very bad for you. It's very bad for the historical and archaeological record. Just don't do it.
Yeah, grim. Ugh. Like, absolutely, just don't do it. Don't be eating mummified bodies. Like, it's wild. But anyway, I wrote that down. Just decided to add it in there. Added to nothing.
I'm very happy you did.
Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure, as always, to have you on. Where can people find you?
Well, they can find me on my Instagram page, which is Dry Wipe History, where I do little historical pictures on my school whiteboard. And they can also find me at Mr Cloke History, which is my YouTube channel. And if you'd like to subscribe to that, it's largely school-based revision resources for exams and things like that. But I'm told that the rapid revision resources on there can be used as a bit of a mini podcast as well. And by the way, Emma, I have, as of yesterday, got my 10,000th subscriber. So I can't say I'm really in the big leagues of YouTube. I'm not about to retire on that, but I'm absolutely amazed that that's happened to my little channel.
That's really exciting. Well done.
It is. Thank you very much. It was really exciting. I got a real kick from that.
Tim, thank you so much, as always, for joining me and for bringing such delicious content.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope you feel better soon.
And we're not done yet, because we've got one episode to go.
One episode to go. Do you want to remind people, actually, before we go, what that episode is about?
Well, that is going to be about haunted battlefields, and we'll see how that goes, because it's such a rich seam of ghost stories. It will be much more conventionally about ancient sites, the history associated with them, and actual ghost stories this time. So if the archaeology hasn't been your thing, then fair enough. I hope you've still enjoyed it, but it will be real ghost stories next time, and I hope that people will be excited about that, because I certainly am.
And this is a topic that people always request from me when I put up, boxes being like, tell me what content you want. People are always like, battlefield ghosts. But like I said to you, I've stayed away from the battlefield ghosts. And now you're doing it. So great.
I'm happy to do that for you. And I can't wait to tell you the stories. I've actually only researched 4 this time, or as in 4 sites rather than 4 stories. But there are so many there. I've had to leave out way more than I've been able to include. So if it goes down well, who knows? It could be the first of many.
Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you again.
Hey there. Looking to level up your shopping experience? Let me introduce you to Amazon Live. If you haven't heard, it's a shoppable video experience where influencers and creators showcase the latest must-haves, all while you shop in real time. And for those who love some celeb gossip, reality stars like Kyle Richards, Lala Kent, and friend of the pod, Paige DeSorbo. On her new show, In Bed with Paige DeSorbo, Paige invites top-tier guests to cozy up in her fluffy bed where they spill secrets, share nighttime routines, and even whip up midnight snacks. Stream and shop new episodes of her series In Bed with Paige DeSorbo every Tuesday at 7 p.m. ET, by going to amazon.com/live/page_DeSorbo. Or you can watch Amazon Live's new live TV channel on Freevee or Prime Video under the DIY section and shop along on your phone.